Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 116 of 2 Minute Talk Tips, the podcast that opens with a practical public speaking tip in the first 2 minutes before getting into a deeper discussion about public speaking. Today's tip comes to us from special guest, Phil Johnson.
My one tip is to cross the screw it line, and that means have a physical space that you are going to walk past before you go on stage, that where you go, you know what? I'm probably never going to see these people again. It really doesn't matter what happens on stage in the long run. Screw it. I'm going for it. And you just put yourself in that character in the way that you would jump off a bridge if you were bungee jumping. You just have to say, screw it. I'm just going to do it. And it's the tearing a Band-Aid off of the speaking world.
Stick around, and after the break, we'll hear more from Phil Johnson. Quick note before we get started. I had the privilege of being the first guy to appear on the Trina Talks podcast this week. Trina Talks is a podcast with inspirational talk based on wisdom gained through Trina's life experiences for women who want motivation and inspiration to go to the next level in their lives, whether personal or professional. Trina L. Martin is a motivational speaker, leader, and cyber tech expert. I share my stroke story and journey as we talk about the challenges, signs, and causes of stroke, and some of the specific challenges that women face. You can listen to that conversation over at strokecast.com/Trina Talks. Welcome back. I like talking with comedians because they're not just interesting people to chat with. The one-on-one conversations may not be the laugh fest that you might think, especially considering how many of them are introverts. But I really like talking with them because comedy is such a precise craft. It involves understanding language, timing, context, culture, and storytelling at a deep level. Sometimes that's explicit, and sometimes it's just sort of something they internalize. You see, most public speakers understand these topics at a basic level, but we can be successful by wielding them in broad strokes, almost clumsily at times. Sometimes we can land our points and messages like we're using a paint roller. Comedians, however, don't have that luxury. They can't use a paint roller. They have to use a fine-tip touch-up brush because their success relies on such precise timing, wording, and even emphasizing the right syllables. So there is a lot that we can learn from them and really up our games as speakers in the non-stand-up comedy context. This week, I speak with comedian and musician Phil Johnson about his journey, testing new content, the importance of stage time, and how he created a pirate-themed podcast. Phil Johnson is a man who gets mistaken for a woman, but only by those not paying attention. That revelation kicks off a battle for self-awareness where comedy and music are the weapons of choice. It's a battle that has taken Phil to such esteemed festivals as the Edinburgh Fringe and Sundance Film Festivals and the top 8 finals of the World Series of Comedy. So now, let's meet Phil Johnson. Phil, thank you so much for joining us here on 2 Minute Talk Tips this week.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You know, I always love having comedians on the show, or I guess more often it's happened in outside conversations, because there's something about the profession that is just very detailed and precise about the craft, which is just amazing. But before we really get into that, let's start off with, what was your earliest memory of speaking to or performing in front of an audience?
My earliest stuff would have been piano recitals, getting up and doing something in front of a class in school. I know that at some point I had to memorize some Shakespeare soliloquy, those types of things. And of course, there was always the every year around Christmas, the entire family going, "Play us a Christmas song," which is why both my brother and I have both sworn off Christmas music forever. But yeah, that would those were my early experiences doing it. Yeah.
Nice. You know, I think that's really interesting too about when you talk about something like a piano recital, it's really a very different type of public performance, but still has a lot of those things coming into play. Because a lot of times when we're speakers or, getting up in front of a crowd and talking, we think about this is all stuff that we've created, that we have said that we have to then deliver. But
sure.
At a piano recital, you're not speaking, you're not necessarily doing your own stuff, but it has an entirely different kind of pressure attached to it.
Right. Yeah. Because you're 8 years old. There's a group of adults in the room, and you're just trying not to screw up.
I think that feeling never really goes away for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
So have you always enjoyed performing then?
No. When I was a kid doing those piano recitals and having to get up in front and talking to the class, hated it with the passion of 1,000 suns. Was never. In fact, I part of me thinks that to this day, I am simply reliving the Freudian traumas of my childhood on stage every night by now making myself go on stage every night. Yeah, no, I was definitely terrified of speaking in front of groups or performing for groups. And I was okay in performing in a group. I played with orchestras and things like that. And in an 80-piece orchestra, you can easily get lost and find yourself not the focus of attention. But being on a stage, either speaking to an audience or performing for an audience by myself was terrifying as a child and absolutely did not like it.
So why would you go ahead and choose this as a career?
Right. I'm an idiot. I was in it for the music. I enjoyed playing music. And when you grow up listening to rock bands and things like that, you start to go, boy, I want to do that. I mean, I grew up in the heyday of MTV and watching my favorite bands on MTV. You just go, man, boy, do they look like they're having a good time up there. And so it was that where I knew I could find the safety of being with a group of people on stage in a band. Even though I ended up being the lead guitar player, so you're still a focus to the audience, but it was still, you're up there with a group and it seemed handleable. And so performing with a band was really how I got more into the idea of doing it. And then everything else kind of snowballed from there to the point now where I stand on stage by myself with just me and a microphone most of the time.
So you came into it from that love of music and the love of performing music in a band. How did you make the transition from that to comedy?
I was playing with my band, and I had recently split off from the guys that I was playing with in the band, and I was just dumping songs into a 4-track. And a couple of those songs came out with funny lyrics. They were just goofy lyrics. It was stuff that the other guys in the band had never wanted to play because they were super serious and all. And I put some of those songs together, and I played them at a music convention in Las Vegas that one of my mentors was putting on. And we were just sitting around jamming around the pool one night, a bunch of us musicians, and I played a couple of these goofy songs for them. And the next morning they were like, everybody else was like, that's the stuff you should be doing. And I was like, no, those are B-sides. I'm going to leave those for extra tracks. And they're like, no, seriously, we can't get the stupid Whale Blubber song out of our head. And so they were like, that's what you should be doing. And so I got invited to do I had started performing a little bit solo at that time, as well as reforming the band. And I got invited to do a comedy music show in San Francisco at a place called the Hyena Theater that's not there anymore. And it was all comedy music. And so I got up there, I played the 3 comedy songs that I had. And now when I go back and listen to the recording, it's absolutely cringeworthy. But the MC of that night was a lady named Lynn Ruth Miller, who at the time was 72 years old and also getting her start in comedy. Which was amazing. And she's still performing. She lives in London now, and she performs all over the UK and things like that.
That is fantastic.
Yeah, she's really great. So she said, hey, I need a guitar player in my act to play Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols while I throw lingerie at the audience. And I was like, all right, I'm down. And that's what we did. And so I sort of became a little bit part of her act. And the shows that she was taking me to locally had heard that I had some funny songs. And they were like, do you want to do a set? And I was like, yeah, sure. That sounds cool. They're like, can you do 7 minutes? And I was like, I did 4 hours with my band last week. Yeah, I can do 7 minutes. And then you realize how ungodly long 7 minutes can be on stage. And from there, it just kind of snowballed. And a lot of the traditionalists, when I first started, I lived off those 3 songs for the first year and a half. And the traditionalists were like, you're not a real comic. You don't know how to do this. And so I learned how to do stand-up along the way because I'd always been a stand-up fan. I just never thought I'd be doing it. And And then, so I just started working at the stand-up portion of my show too. And now both of them are mixed in there. And so it was absolutely just sort of an accident that I got into it. And then I realized that there was a whole bunch of opportunity available to me if I could tell jokes.
That's awesome. It's amazing how these things that we just do as part of our lives that we do when we don't have to, like write those other songs and those things that are actually really personal to us, can actually go ahead and just sort of leak out into other aspects and set us on an entirely different path.
Yep. That was it exactly.
So, I mean, what is performing music and performing comedy? What do they really have in common?
Less than you might think. I think a lot of performers or non-performers will see a lot of similarities between the two. In music, if the audience isn't paying attention, you can still get through the song okay. And you can be background music at an event and things like that. I was never good at being background music. I was always pay attention to me music. Whereas with comedy is a much more delicate art form in that if the room isn't set up just right, if the audience isn't in the right mood, if the sound system is a little bit off, there are so many things that can be a detriment to a comedy show that are less of a thing in a music show. In a music show, as long as the sound works and the audience is present, you can put on a show. Some of them will watch, some of them won't. But you want them all to watch, but they're not always. You can, if people are talking at the bar, you can still throw a rock show. Comedy is a very, very delicate art form that requires a specific atmosphere for it to be at its best. So they can be very different in those ways. Similarities, I think as a performer, it's a lot about being a character, putting yourself out there in uncomfortable ways. Sometimes if you watch a music video, none of those performers would ever move like that in real life. That is a character. That is a character they're putting on stage. And so I think from that performer point of view, there are those types of similarities of how you perform. To me, it's always just putting on an acting guise of some sort, and that's the character I'm playing that night.
Fascinating. It's like comedy, it sounds like, has just then become such a much more precise exercise in getting the mix right, and the audience and the crowd and relating to the crowd. So, I mean, as part of that, when you're putting together a set, or you're putting together a bit or a joke or a series of jokes, I mean, what is your process for going ahead and putting that together and bringing those pieces together?
Like right now, I'm finishing up a new hour that I'm going to film for my 4th special later this year, and putting together an hour of comedy at the fastest would take a year to a year and a half. It's a rather lengthy writing and trial and error process that we go through. This current hour has taken me just over 4 years to write so far, and it's still being tweaked and massaged as we go along. So the process I might write an idea for a joke in the notepad in my phone, and then come back to it months later when I actually, remember what I meant the first time when I wrote it down, because that's always questionable, and then find a fresh angle on it that I might not have thought about the first time. So if I write a joke, if it's just a joke, like a real simple, one-liner, setup and punch type of thing, I might test it out on Twitter or Facebook or someplace like that to kind of gauge a little bit of response on it, and then put it on stage. And then once you put it on stage, you start to then massage the wording of it. Some words are funnier than others. You always want to make sure that the order of the words is very precise. Not every comic works like that, but some of us do, where the wording is essential to making the joke work. Because I've had jokes not work, and then I literally flip the order of 2 words and get the laugh. So it can be very, very precise like that. Most of my stuff is much more longer form bits, where taking a joke out of context doesn't work very well. Because you have to have gone through the journey of the first 30 seconds of the bit to understand the joke that happens in 45 seconds. And otherwise, it absolutely makes zero sense whatsoever. So a lot of my stuff is hard to take out of the context of the 2 or 3 minute bit that it's a piece of. And so for that, I just have to take it on stage. And usually what I'll do is I don't do the open mic scene much anymore. It hurts my brain and it hurts my heart. I'll go if my calendar is really, really empty and I'm really, really desperate for some stage time, I'll go hit an open mic. But for the most part, I will try out new material when I'm doing at least a 30 or 45-minute show where I can sandwich, 2 minutes in there and try it out between other stuff that I know works so that I can kind of get a gauge on it and get a read and see how the audience is going to take it. Because I always want to put on a good show. And if I have a 5-minute set at a mic and 4 of those minutes is going to be new material, I guarantee it's not going to be a good show. But if I am going up to do 45 minutes and 3 minutes of it is new stuff, that's still going to be a good show. Nobody's going to remember that 3 minutes that sucked halfway through.
Right. Exactly.
So I will test it out on stage and then go back to my hotel room and tweak it and rewrite it and tweak it and rewrite it. You just keep putting it up on stage. And I find that the more you put it up on stage, the more refined it gets as a story. In the same way that if you're telling a story to a group of people at a party that you're talking to, and it's a story that you've told 1,000 times before about that crazy ski trip to Aspen. The story gets refined and refined and refined and refined until it has the maximum punch in all the places that you want it. Stand-up comedy is just the same thing. We just do it on a more diligent day-by-day basis.
There's a lot of great stuff in there to unpack for speakers. I think one of the things I want to talk about first is, obviously, going to the open mic scene that, as you say, it hurts your brain right now, but you still got to do it because you still need the stage time. And I think a lot of speakers, just don't get up on stage enough.
Right. Yeah. Certainly as a new comic, I've been doing comedy 14 years now. In my first couple of years, you hit those open mics, you get every bit of stage time that you possibly can because you're not really practicing the material. You're practicing being a person on stage in front of an audience. That's the difference there.
And that's a great distinction to draw that I don't think a lot of folks even realize, that you're not practicing the material, you're practicing being on stage and delivering it and just making that process just a part of your life and a part of what you do.
Right. Yeah. I will often have very new comics or people who haven't even tried it yet. They'll say, "Oh, I've been writing and I've got 10 minutes of stuff and what should I do?" And I say, don't even worry about what you're actually going to say on stage. Have some things, but more importantly, get on stage and you're going to bomb your first 15 times and that's okay. Nobody's going to care or remember. But you have to practice being that character on stage. And that's something that's always in development. We're always sort of developing our character and our persona and our point of view on stage our whole career.
What you say there too, where you're always developing that character, developing that persona, just like when you're continuing to refine and revise a joke, it's one of those things my high school English teacher used to say in senior year English was that good writing is never finished.
Right. It's only abandoned.
Yeah. You don't complete something, you stop it.
Right. Yep.
You also talk about the idea, you get the idea for a joke, you may make a note, and then you sort of work on it. I think that becomes really powerful for speakers with the rising importance of telling stories on stage. Storytelling is so important for connecting with folks. And, as you tell it, you're crafting stories to take your jokes through. But in order to craft a story, you first have to just collect these different stories that you know. And it doesn't mean it's going to be a good story or in its final version the very first time you tell it or the very first time you conceive it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely not. In fact, it probably won't be. It's going to be rough. There's going to be too many words. There's going to be things in the wrong order, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's the process of working through it and alternately rewriting it and then speaking it out loud and rewriting it and speaking it out loud. That becomes that refining process.
Absolutely. And that speaking it out loud is so important because the other thing about just getting up on stage and just getting your stage time is time on the stage is a time warp. It goes faster or slower than you ever expected it would go.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. I always tell people that they'll go, "Oh, how was that show last week?" And I'll be like, "I don't remember, honestly." Because if it was a good show, I don't remember the show pretty much as soon as I walked off stage. If I remember the show, chances it was a bad show. I was too up in my head. Things were going wrong. That's the stuff I'm going to remember. The great shows are a blur that I do not remember 5 minutes after I walk off stage.
Kind of like an airplane flight. The good ones you don't remember.
Right, exactly.
So one of the things you talk about, the audience is so important. As you're going out to your different performances and talking with different crowds, I mean, how much do you typically know about your audience in advance? Is it just a bunch of random folks, or is it mainly your dedicated fans that are coming out now? Or what do you know about your audience when you get up on stage?
It's I'm at the place in my career where I have a draw in some places, and other places you just get a completely random audience, and that is just part of the game. You grow up from the beginning in performing as just having that random audience, and that could be 4 drunks at the bar. That could be a corporate gig full of people you're just hoping not to offend. It could be, a comedy club in a random city that you've never been to before. Like, I mean, for me, the diciest aspect is always going into a new market that I've never played before. Like, I just played Tennessee for the first time a few months ago. I played Louisville, Tennessee. The shows were great, but it took me a couple of shows to really lock into the way that area thinks about things. Because it's from my material, it's very obvious who I am without, people always ask me if I talk politics on stage and things like that. And I really don't, because the material that I'm doing pretty much belies my lifestyle and politics without me having to explain it to people. And so when I go into a place that I know for sure does not share the same politics and lifestyle as I do, it takes a couple of run-throughs with those audiences to really figure out how to lock in with them and find that common ground. So a random assortment of people that's a regular occurrence for us. We have no idea what we're going into, and that's part of the excitement of the job.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're sort of working with that audience and sort of locking into it over the first couple of shows, is that a conscious process where you're making changes, or is that just something that happens unconsciously as you're just sort of gradually adapting to the audience? Like, when a lot of folks go to spend time in a different part of the country and they start picking up a little bit of a local accent.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I mean, part of it's mostly very conscious, and then it becomes unconscious when you've been doing it for a while. Where if I'm going into a new market, the conscious thought is, I'll try this bit at the Thursday night show, and that didn't go well. Let's not do that bit, because apparently I have a bit about my girlfriend and I. We don't have kids, and how much we don't like kids, and we don't like other people's kids. And I'll end up in a room where it's like, oh, there's a whole bunch of parents here tonight, and that bit is not going to work. And so sometimes I can tell ahead of time. I'll go around and actually talk to people in the audience before the show sometimes, if I'm really trying to get a feel for what's going on in a new place. And that's always helpful because I can, talk to them one-on-one a little bit and get a feel for where they're going to be mentally for the show. And then I can kind of gauge my material off that. Other times it's I kind of will shove it down their throats a little bit if I think if it's a bit that I really want to do, or I think it's if it's a bit that might be thought-provoking for that audience in a way that they haven't thought about that subject before. I'm happy to kind of force the issue a little bit on them. And to me, that's fun. I've also walked audiences doing that before. There was one time where I was playing a theater show, and it was pretty full. It was in Morgan Hill, California, and I started into a very lengthy bit about Aristotle's view of the structure of the universe and how that related to the Catholic Church not accepting the number 0 as a real thing until the year 2000, I think it was. And the premise of that being, how long is it going to take them to accept gay marriage when they didn't even accept the number 0? And it was a long bit, and people were walking like crazy. And my mom was in the audience, and I could see her just like, just stop. And I'm like, no, I'm going to finish this bit. Because I yelled at them halfway through the bit. I said, I'm going to tell Jesus that you guys were laughing at anal sex jokes a half an hour ago from the other comedian. I had a point in doing it,
Right.
and
Right.
so that is a very unusual situation. But there will be times where I go, I think it would be interesting to see how this bit flies or crashes in front of this audience, and I'll play with it and see what happens. And then I wouldn't do it again the next night because I want to get hired back.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Ultimately, you're the most important audience is the one who hired you and is signing the paycheck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I've had places where I didn't go over with the audience, and the club bookers and owners will go, "No, we think you're hilarious. That audience didn't get it, so you're cool. We'll have you back." So that happens sometimes too.
And I suppose sometimes if they're not spending all their time just laughing hysterically, they may be going up to the bar and buying more drinks anyway, which ultimately is what the bar owner wants.
That's true.
So you also talked there about going ahead and meeting the audience beforehand. What I think is really interesting is I'm hearing more and more about that idea from other performers and other speakers. I think I know Dave Jackson, host of the School of Podcasting, talked about it when he was on this show a few months back, of greeting the audience members individually before you talk, because not only do you get a feel of where they are, you've also now built an ally in that audience, somebody who can then say, when you get up on stage, hey, yeah, I know that guy. That guy talked to me and acknowledged me.
Yep. That's exactly the game. You want to be friends with them before you go up there, because then they're less likely to get mad or upset or offended by whatever it is you're saying, because now they know you. That's the thing. For me, though, that is actually far more terrifying than going on stage and talking to the whole group. Because comedians and performers in general are often very introverted people. And I am too, until I'm in character. So I have to actually put myself in character the minute I walk into the club rather than the minute I walk on stage, and force myself to go talk to those people one-on-one, because that's a much more awkward situation for me mentally than going up on stage. So that's the part where I kind of have to force myself.
And that's a really interesting perspective. I think, as you said, a whole lot of performers, and what you even find when you talk to folks who spend their life on the speaking circuit and doing presentations, is that they're often also introverts as well. It's so much easier for me and for a lot of folks to go ahead and talk to an audience of 100 or 150 at once than to go ahead and figure out how to have a conversation with another person or another two people when I really don't want to bother them, and all of that stuff comes into play.
Right. And I think what you said there is also part of it, is that it's when we perform, we want it to seem like a conversation, but it's not. We're in control of everything that's happening in the room. Whereas in a one-on-one conversation, you only have 50% control of that conversation. And for an introvert, that's a much more terrifying situation.
Right. The other thing that I think is really interesting too, and you talk about showing up at the club in character, in your stage persona already. And I think that can be really helpful. And one of the things I've talked with folks sometimes about networking events, when you go to business events and meet people, you can go ahead and put on the character of the person who wants to meet people and have conversations, and give yourself just that little bit of distance, which can sometimes help make it possible to go talk to even an individual.
Yeah, for sure. That's exactly the way I have to do it. Even when I am going to a networking event or a party or a convention or whatever it is, I have to do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes I've actually gone ahead and set goals of, you know what, I'm going to go meet 5 people here, and then I'm allowed to leave.
Yep. That's a good one.
So, obviously you want to make friends with your audience. And one of the things that we fortunately don't have to deal with as speakers and trainers, well, trainers, you get it a little bit more, is we don't have to deal with hecklers as much and people actively fighting us. But, that's something that's got to be a part of your life, especially when alcohol is a factor for your audience.
Certainly.
How do you deal with those folks?
I am fairly lucky in that I don't get heckled very often. My persona on stage generally is pretty nice, although over the last year, It's taken on a slightly edgier tone that has resulted in a little bit more heckling. Some comics really invite the heckles where they're very antagonistic with the audience on purpose because that's their character. And that will invite a lot more heckling. For me, when somebody heckles, like this just happened last week, there was a drunk guy at the bar and he was just being loud and kind of being mouthy, and he wasn't like the helpful heckler. You'll get those sometimes too, where they think they're helping the show. And then they'll come up to the merch table after and go, "Hey man, that was great. You know, I was just trying to help you out." And it's like, yeah, don't help me out. I know how to do this. And, but like the guy I had last week, he was just sort of just mouthy at the bar. And I tend to infantilize them as my main go-to tool. This guy was sort of short, round, and hairy. And I was like, calm down, Frodo. Aren't you due back in Hobbiton sometime soon? And that was, but he kept going. It really, literally, and for that guy, it took the bartender yelling in his face, "Shut up, Bob," whatever his name was, because he was a regular, which is it's always dicey to get into it with the regulars because then sometimes the bar doesn't like you. But this guy was on our side. And the bartender like literally shouted in the guy's face before the guy would shut up and quit ruining the show. So for me, I will tend to infantilize them a little bit. I'll just go, "Oh, let's use our inside voice," or something that you would say to a child. And then that is usually a fairly safe, non-antagonistic way to shut them down a little bit. Without really having to get into it. If they kind of think they're helping, if they're trying to be funny and they're just drunk or whatever, the same thing kind of works. Sometimes an audience member will come up with a cool line. That's happened too, where they'll tag my joke, and I'm like, "All right, you win on that one." It doesn't happen often, but every once in a while they'll come up with a cool line. But it's usually just the ones that are drunk and belligerent. Like a lot of clubs will have code words or code phrases that we can say from the stage. Where if I say, "Hey, get that guy a coffee," that means please throw that guy out of the club right now. He's ruining the show. And so some places will have those kind of code phrases that we can use to, point out problems in the audience. There was a show in Colorado Springs last year that I was doing, and I was the middle act, and there was this audience, a couple in the audience, falling all over themselves in the front row, just drunk, falling out of their seats. Like couldn't even sit up straight. And this was the early show. So they had a long night ahead of them. And when the headliner went up, they started actually making out at their table. It's right in front of the stage. The whole audience is staring at them, can't be missed. And the club people were like nowhere to be seen. And so finally the headliner, she called, we were both playing music, both music acts, and she goes, "Hey, Phil, do you have a pick? I forgot my pick." And so I go up there and I hand her a pick, and she goes, "Oh my God, go get the bartender and get these people out of here." And so there's all different ways to, some comics really will engage with a heckler and take great pride in shutting them down. And then putting that video on YouTube about how they dealt with it. I've never been that kind of thing. I want to get back to the show. I don't want to take the chance of things getting super weird and out of whack with some drunk dude in the audience who shouldn't even be there anyway. So I'll usually just kind of infantilize them, treat them like a child a little bit, and go, "All right, just let's use our inside voice and calm down." And it's usually not a problem after that.
Awesome. And one of the things too is I imagine a lot of times. I know when I encounter it doing training scenarios, it's the one person who is antagonistic about the training, doesn't want to be there, thinks he knows more than the presenter, and wants to play stump the presenter and go down all these tangents. And usually the rest of the attendees, the rest of the audience, really hates that guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And can be a great ally in helping to shut them down.
Oh yeah. Oh, if you can turn the audience against a heckler, then you win, guaranteed. Usually, it's not very difficult, but you have to be careful. Like if the heckler is a woman, you have to play much more delicate because the audience is more likely to turn on you if you just lay into her super hard. And especially if she's just sort of drunk and having a good time. If she's really drunk and really having a good time, then you can absolutely lay into them and the audience will be on your side. But there's that element of it too, where you have to go, how far can I go with this person before the rest of the room hates me? And how far can that heckler go? And sometimes I'll let them go until the room hates them. and then turn on them, and that makes it much safer from my end, because you can also, if you do it wrong, you can kill that audience for the rest of the show, and you get nothing out of them after that.
Right, you've got to be careful at managing it. Which one of you is the underdog at that particular moment?
Right, always, yeah.
So you've also, I mean, you've performed around the world, including the Edinburgh Fringe, and what I know very little about that, other than that it is an incredible grind. So what was that experience like?
Mind-blowing. That is one of the most amazing festivals anywhere that I've ever been to. It's a month long, and there are literally hundreds of shows and thousands of performers in town. I was there for 2 weeks, and I had gone over with a package of San Francisco comedians that was produced and put together by Lynn Ruth Miller, the same lady that dragged me into doing stand-up comedy in the first place. I was very green. She had been to the festival, but she'd never produced a show there before. We did a lot of things wrong with that, in that the results that we could have gotten out of performing there, we didn't get, just because we didn't know how to really maximize our opportunities there. But outside of that, it was a fantastic vacation where I got to gig every night, which to me is the perfect combination. To my girlfriend, not so much, but to me, that is the perfect combination. And so we went over there. We did half the run. We did 2 weeks, which was great, because I heard the first 2 weeks of the show, the audiences were light, but by the second half of the month, we had sold out rooms every night, which was great. And it was a lot of really hustling to get people into the show. There was passing out flyers. We had to do press. We had to do guest sets on other people's shows. There was one where we had to do a show on a stage in the middle of the Royal Mile, which is the main drag there through Edinburgh. And so lots of strange performance opportunities where you just step in and go, all right, I'm going to tell jokes into the air and hope somebody's paying attention, and then comes to the show tonight. But other than that, it was just, we did tons of touristy stuff. We went and visited castles. We took a day trip on the bus, and, we went to the military tattoo, and, all sorts of things. But the performances itself, that was the first time I'd ever performed internationally. I had no idea if the material would fly at all, and it did. So that was a great confidence building thing for me to go, okay, this material works in a completely different country. I've probably got something here that I should, keep building on. Because I was fairly new at the time. I think I'd only been doing comedy 2 years. So I don't recommend doing it the way we did it. But it was just a fascinating, mind-blowing experience all the way through.
Wow, fantastic. And, I think one of the things that's really interesting there, too, you talk about your girlfriend didn't necessarily appreciate it, too. I had a similar experience one year with going to CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, that I took my girlfriend with me for that week in Vegas. And I spent, 10 hours a day on the floor talking to customers. And then I come back and just sort of pass out at night, and passing out from exhaustion, not from Vegas itself. And that was a little bit of a disappointing experience for her, since she wasn't actually expecting it to go that way.
It can be. Yeah. For Edinburgh, my girlfriend knew what she was in for. She knew we were going there to do shows, and that we were going to do a bunch of other stuff too. Unfortunately, our shows were at like 10:30 at night, which was great. So we had the whole day to do things. It wasn't like we had a 2 o'clock show. Other trips, however, like we went to Paris this last year, and that was a vacation. And I said, I'm going to book one gig while we're there. And she does not like when I do that. She wants a vacation to be a vacation. Sure. She's like, why do you have to work on vacation? I said, because I like my work, one, and two, I want to see how it flies in this other country. And the show that I did there in Paris was phenomenal. It was, afterwards she said, what was your favorite part of the trip to Paris? I was like, honestly, it was the gig I did. So that for me, that's part of a vacation is putting the stuff up in a new place and seeing if it works. But we don't always agree on that. So that's the way it goes.
and that's how you find out the Los Angeles traffic jokes don't necessarily fly in Paris.
Oh yeah. I've seen people do, like, I was playing in Chicago one night and there was a guy doing Las Vegas jokes, and I was like, it's not gonna work here, man. We see it with San Francisco comics all the time. They'll get out of San Francisco and they're doing Muni and Bart jokes, and it's like, nobody here knows what that is.
Right. And, aside from the culture, even just the vocabulary, the idea of being able to explain what Bart is or what Muni is. And I think that's something a lot of other speakers encounter, is that if you get used to speaking at meetings inside your organization, you're speaking your organization's language. The equivalent of Muni or BART at a Microsoft might be, your ROB and your, the various other abbreviations for meetings and planning processes. You go to speak someplace else, that stuff doesn't mean anything. You got to think about the language and cut the jargon.
Yeah, to the point where I will slightly mimic an accent for where I am sometimes. If I'm playing in the South, I'll let a little bit of that drip in. Not enough where it's noticeable, where they're like, I don't think that's that guy's real accent, but just enough where it's a connection process. Or if I mean, regional accents aren't even nearly as prominent as they used to be, but I will let some of the local jargon slip in if I need to, just as a connection process, and certainly eliminate any. Like I was thinking about doing my new special in Vancouver, Canada, and then I realized I was like, I got to cut so many jokes to do that because like they don't have Jamba Juice there, so I got to cut the Jamba Juice joke. Whatever it is, I was playing in Edmonton, Canada, and I had to cut the Jamba Juice joke, and I had to then turn it into whatever their juice place was there. I can't remember what it was called now, but I tried it the first couple times, and I was like, they don't have that here. I need to use whatever their juice place is, and then the joke worked.
Right, and then that becomes really challenging too because you're playing that to that audience there, but for your special, you probably want that to have a broader appeal to a U.S. audience.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly. So I'm trying to find the place where the most people are going to get most of the jokes. And I never count on 100% because I've just found that rarely is anybody in the audience going to connect with 100% of the material. It's just not going to happen. What you want is the most people connecting with the most material at hopefully the same time.
Awesome. And and that's a lot of work. And one of the things I we often hear advice for nervous speakers is to go ahead and open with a joke. Is that a good idea?
That is a terrible, terrible idea. Because if the joke doesn't land, then your self-confidence goes right through the floor. And there is, if you are giving a speech about a topic and you get an expected level of engagement from the audience, then you're on good footing and you can build on that. The feeling of a joke not landing is like being punched in the chest by a very large man. And that is coming from a group of people like us where regularly jokes don't land. And it is just this void of silence in the room that makes you question your entire life. And so, yeah, for that reason, I don't suggest people start with a joke unless they know it's a joke that is going to absolutely kill every single time. And chances are it just isn't that, because no joke is foolproof.
And if you're already nervous, you're probably not going to be delivering it in the way you need to be able to deliver it to make it land.
Right. Yeah. Chances are when somebody does that, like the delivery is off, or they've come up, they've run across some dad joke that's just not going to fly in the room. Where it can work is if it's a really, really inside joke for the group that you're talking to. I can go up and open with a bit of local material or comment on something that happened in the room during the previous comic or something like that, and generally have that work because it's not as much about the quality writing of the joke as it is about the audience going, hey, we know what that is. We know what that is. So if it's
about the community.
Yeah, it's about the community. If it's a really super inside joke, then that can work. But just a general joke, no.
Obviously getting out on tour and traveling to all these places is a lot of work and a lot of fun, but you've also extended your reach with launching your own podcast. So why did you decide to start your podcast?
I think it's kind of the law now that comics are supposed to have a podcast. And the thought process really behind it is, yes, I can go to Wisconsin and I can play for a club full of people. And on a sold out Saturday night, that might be 150 people that I'm talking to for that evening. Whereas a podcast, if you build it, then you are talking to hundreds, thousands of people all at once on a weekly basis who then get to know you as a person in some way. And that's the important part of it. The podcasts that I like are the ones where the host is really a personality in the show. Like Mark Maron is a great example, because the first 10 minutes of Mark Maron's show is him talking about his life and complaining and you get to know Mark Maron, and then that becomes a draw when he's on the road, because it's just like talking to people before the show. People already feel like they know him and they'll go out and see him. And that's the thing. So my show starts out similarly, where I'm going to, there's a little bit of me in the show, and then we're going to get into the interview or whatever it is we're doing. And that is a community building tactic for getting people to know me, so that when they come to the show, they already feel like there's an in of some sort. For my show, it was, the tough part was finding what kind of show I wanted to do, because comedians will always go, we're going to do a comedy podcast where it's 4 dudes sitting around hanging out and talking. And rarely are those ever actually great shows.
But they are about 85% of the podcast listings.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very, very saturated market, and so many not great shows out there that I wanted to do something different. And that's not the type of shows that I listen to. And I will always look to, what am I listening to that I like, and then how do I incorporate that into something I do? And that's the same thing I do with comedy, where I will see a comic and go, oh, that is a fascinating technique. How can I incorporate that idea into what I'm doing? So for me, it was, I was sitting around trying to figure out what kind of show I wanted to do. I didn't want to do a comedy podcast. Doing a general, like a music podcast, is very difficult because of licensing and legal issues. So that was out. And so I started looking around about, what else do I have that I'm into that I think would be an interesting audience to talk to. I've always been a Disney geek since I was a kid, but there's a ton of Disney podcasts out there who have a much longer history and a much more devoted fan base that I didn't want to try and build off of, just because I thought it was too saturated. And I went through a couple other ideas, cooking or whatever it is, and then I looked around my office, and I realized how many pictures of pirates I have up in my office. And I looked at my T-shirt drawer and realized how many T-shirts I have with pirates on them on the front. And I looked at my book collection, and I realized how many books about pirates I have in my collection. And I went, oh, maybe I should do a podcast about pirates. And so that's what I ended up doing. And I did some research before starting it by looking around to see if there was anybody doing anything in that realm. And all I found was a show that played pirate music. And that was it. And there was nobody talking to the community at all, as in doing interviews. And I like interview shows. That's what I listen to most of the time. And so there was nobody interviewing the people in that pirate fandom community about the things that they're creating for the community. And I thought, well, that would be an interesting way to go. And soon after that, a couple other pirate podcasts showed up, but they were history podcasts, more like Dan Carlin, Hardcore History, that kind of thing that they're doing. So that still didn't step on what I was doing, and in fact just created more community that I could build from, because I had a different angle on it. And so that's what I started doing 170 some episodes ago, was interviewing people in the pirate fandom community. And that could be everything from the guy that wrote the score for the last Pirates of the Caribbean film, to actors and authors and famous people, all the way down to, like, I had a guy on that specializes building ships and bottles. And he was like, do you want to talk about that? And I was like, yeah, you darn right I want to talk about ships and bottles, and guys that make pirate hats and things like that. Or I've got a guy next week, he just released a new pirate board game, so we're going to talk about game design. Rarely is the show ever actually about pirates. It's about whatever their discipline is in their craft. So if it's an author, we're talking about writing. If it's a game designer, we're talking about game design. If it's about music, we're talking about music, and that keeps things interesting and varied, so that the show doesn't get boring.
Right. And the pirate aspect is really just the entry into all of these other fascinating people's lives.
Exactly. Yeah. When I talk to shipwreck divers, we talk a lot about diving, because diving terrifies me. That's not something I ever want to do. So I want to find out what their experience is as a diver, and so, yeah, the pirates is just an entry, because I'll have guests sort of like, I really don't know that much about pirates. I just put this thing out, and I'm like, cool, we're going to talk about the thing that you do. And they're always like, oh, okay, whew, great.
So which of your guests has been the most surprising to you? Which surprised you the most?
Yeah, there was one of the real surprising ones was this last year. It was Anne Chambers, who is an Irish author who specializes in Grace O'Malley, who's Ireland's pirate queen. She's a historic pirate slash warrior woman slash maybe not either of those things in Irish history and myth. And I didn't know anything really about the topic going in. I didn't know how prominent Anne Chambers is in Irish literary society. And so we got into it, and it was a fascinating conversation about where her life had come from. She started out in banking, and she hated it, and had changed into this author who had found all this success and writing about this one small myth in Irish culture, and finding out more about the Grace O'Malley story. And then we ended up, kind of doing some compare and contrast. I asked her, I said, does Grace O'Malley fascinate you because you see yourself in her, or because you'd cross the street when she walked by and you're terrified of her? And she said, it's definitely the latter. So it was really interesting to get into the whys of why she was writing so much, because she's written books and books and books and books about people connected to Grace O'Malley. And it was interesting to find out why she was that fascinated by the story and how her own life had evolved around that story. And it was very, I knew it would be a good talk going in. I didn't know how good a talk it was going to be going in. So that was a nice surprise one. And it turned out to be the favorite episode of the year for everybody.
What was it that drove your interest in pirates? How did you come to accumulate all this pirate stuff?
Oh, like I said, I've been a Disney dork since I was a kid. And going on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride as a child at Disneyland is enough to turn you to piracy, I guess is the way to go. And it is probably the most common origin story for people in the pirate fandom is, I went on Pirates of the Caribbean, man, and holy cow, yeah, that was it. And later, if they're younger, then it was the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, the first couple at least. And so we have more Jack Sparrows running around pirate festivals than we know what to do with. But it was that, and it was that my mom was very into that ride too, and we would literally ride through Pirates of the Caribbean looking for home decorating techniques. And we'd be like, oh, look, that is so cool with the thing up there. And it was one of those things that it was a transformational entertainment experience for me, unlike any other I've experienced since or before that. And once you do that, then you go, oh, well, I wonder what the actual stories are behind those guys, and I would watch the, Captain Blood and Cutthroat Island, or whatever came out that had a pirate story to it, and eventually you just kind of start going into it. And I was not nearly as into it as I thought I was, honestly, when I started the show. I have learned so much more in the last couple of years of doing this podcast than I ever knew about pirates before. I mean, any sort of fandom culture is always, I think, off-putting to people outside that culture, because they go, I don't even have an entrance into that culture, whatever it is. I don't feel like anywhere near enough of a nerd to be into whatever that is,
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like I can keep up with those people. So it had to be a flip in mindset of, I'm going to learn from these people. And I do not portray myself as any sort of pirate history expert on the show. I portray myself as, I'm the dude who's just going to go talk to these interesting people that know way more than I do about this subject on whatever that subject is. And it's a much easier way to go for myself mentally, rather than trying to portray myself as some sort of expert that I don't feel like I am in that particular case.
Awesome. And it sounds like it's also a really nice bonding point with your mother.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah. Yeah, we were the Halloween house on the block when I was a kid. We were deep into that stuff. Pirates of the Caribbean is number one, and the Haunted Mansion is number two. And if I can go to Disneyland and ride those two things, it's a good day.
Nice. The other thing you mentioned there that I think is really interesting is having an entry point and having someone who can come into it from the outside and giving somebody a point of access to that world. I think when we look at how, for example, Doctor Who has been produced, the role of the companion in that show for the Doctor has really just always been that entry point for the civilian, how they can learn about this world and learn about this fictional universe through this one character who is also going on that entry journey into this universe at the same time a new viewer is.
Oh, I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because that is the number one example of something that I don't know how to get into. Because I have friends that are like, Doctor Who, and I'm like, the show's been on since the '60s. I don't even know how to get into that show, because it seems like it's just so deep and so complex as a universe now that I just go, I don't think I have time for that, you know?
Exactly. They've done some really interesting things for the show in terms of providing good points to onboard. And usually when there is a new person taking over the role of the Doctor, that's an accessible point to jump into the show, because they go ahead and re-explain everything. So, you know, the classic stuff, that stuff's got to come later. But, you know, everything from starting with the new series, which launched 11 years ago in 2008, I think it was, or, you know, every 3 or 4 years, there's a good jumping on point, and then you can start going back. But the big problem I find with going back to the classic stuff is not only do you have the mythology to learn, the production values are so different, and the storytelling methodology is just glacial. You know, you know, they're still, the BBC was still learning how to make TV in the 60s.
Yeah. For me, that is a huge part of watching or consuming old media. I listen to a lot of really old music. I like old films. Things like that. In fact, we just did a special episode of my show a couple weeks ago as an experimental episode where I took a deep dive into a movie called The Black Pirate from 1926. It's a silent film.
Oh, wow.
But it's in Technicolor, which I thought was really interesting. So that was sort of the jumping off point for the show. And that was what I was noticing all the way through. I was like, oh my God, this scene is going on way too long here. And they're gonna, and it had like the dialogue cards and stuff. And I was like, how long are they going to lead this up? How slow did people read in 1926? This dialogue card is still up. And that is, I always think you have to look at art in the time context of when it was made. And I think that's very important for any art. Comedy, God, especially comedy. If you go back and listen to Sam Kinison in 1988, 1989, that stuff does not hold up well now. But if you listen to it in the context of 1988, you can go, okay, I see what's going on there. The same with listening to, Louis Armstrong and his Hot 7 recordings from the late 20s and early 30s. It's very difficult to listen to if you're listening to it with 2019 ears. But if you put yourself in that 1928 set of ears, then you can hear how mind-blowing and groundbreaking music like that actually was at the time. So you have to, I think, to really appreciate any sort of art, you have to know about the history and what was going on at the time as well to really get into it.
So Phil, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on. It was really fun.
Phil has tour dates throughout the year. You can find his schedule, links to his podcast, and several of his videos over at 2minutetalktips.com/Phil. You can also find links to conversations I had with other comedians on 2 Minute Talk Tips. I spoke with my buddy John Clark way back in episode 3, and with British comedian and host Izzy Lawrence in episode 62. Again, all those links are over at 2minutetalktips.com/Phil. So check out all of those links and more at 2minutetalktips.com/Phil. Share this episode with a friend, colleague, or relative by giving them the link, you guessed it, 2minutetalktips.com/Phil. Subscribe for free to 2 Minute Talk Tips in your favorite podcast app. And as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
Two-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.